On the morning of April 9, 1865, Virginia was bathed in a pale, dim light, as if the sky itself knew that today was the day of the end of a tragedy. The morning mist hung over the barren fields, where horses had once trotted and guns had fired, leaving only old tire tracks and muddy dirt mixed with dried blood. The air was so still that you could hear the wind rustling through the bare branches of the trees, and the pungent smell of old gunpowder that had been clinging to the ground for months. Appomattox Courthouse was not a grand building or a grand square. It was just a small village of brick and wooden houses, dirt roads, and faded white picket fences. Yet this humble place was the end of a war that had torn the country apart for 4 years. And on that morning, two men, representing two parts of the country, were approaching a historic moment that would change the fate of millions. General Robert Edward Lee, 58, was tall and lean but sturdy, with a silver beard and deep eyes. He came from a Virginia family with a military tradition. His father was General Henry "Lighthorse Harry" Lee, a hero of the American Revolution. Lee was educated at West Point Military Academy and was known for his discipline and tactical ingenuity. Before the war, Lee had served in the Union Army and was highly regarded by many Northern commanders. But when Virginia seceded, he chose to follow his home state, despite his opposition to slavery. For Lee, loyalty to his state was a sacred bond. General Ulysses Simpson Grant, a few years younger than Lee, came from a more humble background, and had experienced personal and professional failures before the war broke out. Grant did not appear pompous or aristocratic. He was simple, quiet, and wore a rumpled coat and a gray cap. But behind that rustic appearance was an iron will and outstanding command ability. Grant had been underestimated, but in the campaigns of Vicksburg and Chattanooga he proved himself a man who could exploit every advantage and persevere to the end. It was this tenacity that propelled him to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Union Army. In late March and early April 1865, Lee's Confederate Army was exhausted. They were surrounded, their food supplies were exhausted, and their numbers were severely reduced. The soldiers were emaciated, their boots were torn, and many had no more ammunition in their guns. Meanwhile, Grant's army was overwhelming in numbers, weapons, and supplies. On April 2, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, fell. Lee was forced to retreat west, hoping to join up with other Confederate forces. But his retreat was blocked, and by April 8, Lee was pinned down at Appomattox. The next morning, he knew he had no choice but to surrender. Around noon, at Wilmer McLean's house, a modest 2-story brick house, the meeting took place. Ironically, McLean had lived in Manassas, where the first battle of the Civil War had taken place, and he had moved to Appomattox to escape the war. But fate had brought war to him again. In the final battle, Lee arrived first, dressed in a neat gray uniform, sword strapped, shoes shining. Grant arrived later, dressed simply, his coat muddy, his hat askew. The two men shook hands, a handshake between two rivals who had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. Now just two soldiers finishing their service. Grant opened the conversation, recalling old memories of their time in the United States Army, in an attempt to ease the tension. Lee responded politely, but his eyes remained solemn. Grant proposed a generous condition. Confederate soldiers would be allowed to take their horses home to continue farming. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. No one would be taken prisoner if they obeyed the law and stopped fighting. Lee agreed. He understood that Grant wanted reconciliation rather than punishment. When the documents were drawn up and signed, Lee rose, shook Grant's hand again, and left. Outside, as Lee rode back to camp, the Union soldiers stood silently, saluting, not cheering. It was a rare moment when respect overcame hatred. April 9, 1865, was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one of reconstruction, reconciliation, and also of a time of challenge. Grant's leniency and Lee's proud but realistic demeanor set a precedent. The end of war need not mean revenge. That moment became an iconic image for the concept of union, not just a political bloc, but a nation trying to find itself again after breaking itself apart. As the surrender papers were signed at Appomattox, the last shots of the war in Virginia died down. Groups of Confederate soldiers began to disperse along the red dirt trails. There were no parades, No flags, just weary footsteps. Some carried their personal rifles as souvenirs. Others had nothing but their worn gray coats and battered hats. Many no longer recognized themselves. The hands that had once held the plow were now calloused by gunfire. The eyes that had once lit up before harvest were sunken from lack of sleep. They walked, no one sure where they were going, only in the direction they had called home. On a map, the distance from Appomattox to the southern countryside was not too far. But for a soldier who had just escaped 4 years of war, it was the journey of a lifetime. Roads were broken, bridges were destroyed, towns were deserted. Every mile bore the marks of bombs, blackened electric poles, fallen trees, rice fields plowed by artillery. But the hardest part was not the terrain, but the mentality. Their steps were heavy not because of the mud but because of the unanswered question, what will we return to? Along the way, they met other groups of soldiers, familiar faces from the trenches. Now walking side by side not as comrades in arms, but as men who had suffered a common defeat. Some chose to remain silent. Some talked about plans to replant their gardens. Some just muttered the names of loved ones like a prayer. I pictured a scene. Thomas, a 23-year-old infantryman from Georgia, carried in his pocket a letter to his mother that had not been sent since 1864. The letter said he would return before winter. Winter had passed. It was now spring, but the house was still uncertain. This story is not just Thomas's, but that of thousands of other soldiers, carrying a frozen past, now returning to a completely different present. When the soldiers returned to their villages, many realized that home had become an abstract concept. The fields where they had harvested rice were overgrown with grass above their knees. The stables were empty. The fences collapsed. Many houses were abandoned, with broken roofs, shutters, and furniture stolen or destroyed. Worse, many families were broken up. Wives and children had fled to other regions. Parents had died in disease or poverty. Some returned to find new graves of their loved ones right next to their fields. It felt less like a reunion than a visit to a mass grave for a dead way of life. Southern soldiers not only faced a ruined landscape but also had to struggle with themselves. They believed they were fighting for an ideal, even one tied to slavery, and now that ideal had been defeated. Even wronged. This humiliation sent many into an identity crisis. Who was I if I wasn't a soldier? What had I sacrificed my friends and my youth for? Many fell into silence, or sought sobriety in alcohol. Others tried to reintegrate by finding work. But the Southern economy had collapsed. Jobs were scarce, and competition was fierce. If the South was devastated by day, it was a land of ghosts at night. Towns were silent, as if the living were learning to live with the dead. The occasional oil lamp cast shadows on cracked walls. The barking of dogs at night reminded soldiers of their vigils in the woods. The whistling of wind through the door reminded them of the sound of bullets tearing through the air. The memories of war did not lie still, it clung to every sound, every smell, every shadow. While many soldiers felt like outcasts, there were individuals who began to think of a different future. Without slaves, without a monoculture cotton economy. Some realized that the South would have to learn a different way of life if it was to survive. Ideas about opening factories, learning trades, working with free blacks began to emerge, despite strong opposition from those who still clung to the past. One of the most common images of the time was of a soldier returning home on his old horse. Grant had allowed them to bring their horses back to plow their fields. And for many, the horse was the only thing that had survived the war intact. It was not just a means of transportation, but a witness to 4 years of life and death. Looking at a skinny soldier, his back bent with fatigue, riding a bony horse, we see the whole story of the South, a land of survivors but exhausted. Even though they had surrendered, many soldiers still felt a sense of disobedience. They no longer held guns, but in their fireside conversations, they would still mention, "When we won at Chancellorsville," or "If Jackson had lived." This nostalgia, over time, would become part of the lost cause culture, the mythologizing of the pre-war South, viewing defeat as a heroic tragedy. And it would influence Southern politics and society for decades. As the spring of 1865 turned to warm days, the golden sunshine stretched across the cotton and tobacco fields of the South, but it was an illusion. In reality, most of the fields were fallow. overgrown with weeds, interspersed with mounds of earth torn up by artillery. Roads once filled with wagons carrying cotton were now only the tracks of wagons fading in the dust. From Virginia to Mississippi, from Georgia to Texas, the traces of war were not only in people's memories but also on the land. Factories, bridges, granaries, all were either destroyed or abandoned. Small towns that had been fueled by trade were like skeletons, their frames still standing but their interiors devoid of life. Before the war, the South had been the cotton basket of the world. Rich on cotton and tobacco exports, the system relied almost entirely on slave labor. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, the entire economic structure collapsed. Plantations that had grown to hundreds of acres were now empty. With no workers, the owners had either died in the war, gone bankrupt, or moved elsewhere. Even those who still held onto their land were at a loss as the old labor force was now free, with the right to refuse work or demand pay. Trade routes were severely disrupted, railroads were destroyed, and many major bridges were burned or blown up during the war. Goods could not be transported, and both production and consumption were at a standstill. Confederate paper money was now worthless, leaving people penniless. Some southern towns that had thrived on trade or cotton mills became ghost towns. Stores were shuttered, signs faded, and dust covered the windows. The administrative buildings were deserted. Papers were scattered on the floor. Rats nested in old desk drawers. At night, the wind whistled through broken windows, creating an eerie sound, making newcomers think they were hearing someone calling from the past. In that atmosphere, memories of war mixed with the haunting loss, creating a feeling that the South was living in a world between two eras, unable to escape the old but also not yet fully entering the new. The people of the South after the war faced shortages of almost everything. Food. Crops failed. Many places had to eat spoiled corn and rotten potatoes. Clothes. Most were torn, patched. Shoes became luxuries. Medicines. Epidemics such as malaria and dysentery spread rapidly. Medical stations were few and lacking in everything. Women, accustomed to domestic roles, were now forced to work in the fields or factories, while men struggled to find work again. Children in many places were unable to go to school because their schools had been destroyed or their families could not afford to buy books. In addition to the material loss, the South bore a psychological wound that was difficult to heal. The entire community had to face the complete collapse of the ideals they had believed in, that slavery and the old way of life were sustainable. The humiliation of defeat was mixed with the pain of losing loved ones, losing land, and losing jobs. This mentality caused many Southerners to become withdrawn, alienating themselves from Northerners and even newly freed blacks. Many turned to alcohol, gambling, or secret societies to cling to their lost sense of power. The pre-war South was a clearly stratified society, the plantation owners at the top, poor white farmers at the bottom, and then black slaves. After the war, this structure was reversed. Slaves became free people, able to find work, marry legally, and go to school. Plant owners lost their forced labor, and many fell into poverty. Poor white farmers found themselves in direct competition with blacks in the labor market. This change created intense social tensions, which sowed the seeds of many racial conflicts in the following decades. While the overall picture was bleak, there were small bright spots. Some communities organized cooperatives, sharing farming tools and seeds. Missionaries and charities from the North helped rebuild schools and clinics. Some farmers tried new crops such as peanuts, sugarcane, or cash crops for domestic consumption rather than export. These efforts, though small, gave hope that the South could find a new path, away from total dependence on cotton and forced labor. For Northerners, the post-war South was both a place that needed to be rebuilt and a land that was at risk of rebellion if not tightly controlled. For Europeans, the South had gone from being an important source of cotton to an unstable land, losing its competitiveness in the international market. Foreign journalists who came here all had the same impression: this is a beautiful but tired land. Like a once brilliant noblewoman now reduced to a faded shadow. In 1865, as the dust of war cleared, the American South stood at a historic crossroads. While the North had a relatively developed industrial base, with railroads, steel mills, and machine shops, the South was still almost entirely dependent on agriculture, especially cotton and tobacco. But the war had destroyed the plantation system, freed slave labor, and severed many trade routes. If the South was to survive, it could not rely on its old fields alone. A new world was emerging, where industry and machinery were gradually replacing human and horsepower. Before the Civil War, Southern cotton was considered white gold, exported to England, France, and many other countries. But after the war, many plantations were destroyed. The labor force was changing. Blacks were now paid or free to leave the land. International markets sought new supplies from India and Egypt. When the Cotton Empire collapsed, the South was left without its main economic support. Once wealthy landowners were now heavily in debt, forced to sell their land or find other jobs. This paved the way for the arrival of Northern investors who brought capital, technology, and a vision for industrialization. In the early years of Reconstruction, a number of Southern towns began to emerge. Cotton mills using steam engines, sawmills to make use of timber from the forests, tobacco mills to produce consumer goods rather than just raw leaf for export. At first, this was only small scale, but it created new jobs for both poor whites and free blacks. However, the change was not smooth. Many Southern veterans, accustomed to farm work, were not accustomed to the factory environment, the strict timekeeping, and the new technology. One of the most important changes was the restoration and expansion of the railroad system. During the war, many roads were destroyed to keep out the enemy. Now, the railroads were seen as the key to trade and industry. Northern companies invested in building new lines connecting towns to seaports. This helped transport goods faster, open up new consumer markets, attract rural labor to towns. But this also came with the South's growing dependence on Northern capital and management, leaving many people feeling economically occupied even after the war ended. After the abolition of slavery, the Southern labor market changed dramatically. Free blacks, many worked for factories or became artisans. Poor white farmers, who had despised manual labor in factories, now forced to compete for survival. Northern investors often hired people willing to accept low wages, creating racial and class tensions. Strikes and small-scale riots occurred when wages were low, working conditions were harsh, or when black workers were paid the same as white workers. Before the war, most of the Southern population lived in rural areas. Industrialization led to the expansion of towns into small urban areas. Workers' quarters appeared, cramped but bustling. Salons, tailor shops, and pharmacies opened to serve the workers. Markets became more diverse in goods, not only agricultural products but also industrial consumer goods. However, rapid urbanization also led to problems: pollution, crime, and widespread disease due to inadequate sanitation. For many, industrialization was an opportunity to escape poverty. For others, it was a threat to the elimination of traditional ways of life. Young people were often open to change, willing to learn new trades. The older generation often viewed factories as tradition-crushing furnaces, where people became anonymous cogs. This created a clear generation gap, a factor that would influence Southern politics and society for decades. Despite causing conflict, industrialization helped the South reduce dependence on one type of agricultural product, create jobs and vocational training opportunities, better integration into the national trade system. It also made the South gradually share many economic characteristics with the North, thereby reducing the gap in social structure, although the psychological division remained deep. Industrialization in the South during this period was slow and unsynchronized. Investment capital was mainly from the North, so profits often flowed back to the outside. New technology was not yet popular. Many factories still used old equipment. Labor lacked skills, requiring time to train. Thus, despite progress, the South was still unable to catch up with the North in output and productivity throughout the 19th century. April 9, 1865, ended the fighting, not the division. As the South laid down its arms, the federal government faced a difficult problem. How could the seceded states return to the Union without causing further resistance? How could the legal status and rights of millions of newly freed slaves be determined? The period of 1865 to 1877, known as the Reconstruction-era, Was the answer, a period of both reform and controversy. From the beginning, there were three streams of opinion within American politics. Moderates wanted to quickly reintegrate the South without punishing too harshly. Radical Republicans wanted deep reform, ensuring civil rights and voting rights for blacks, while limiting the power of the former Southern leaders. Conservative Southerners wanted to restore as much of the old order as possible, maintaining white supremacy. The collision of these three approaches made the Reconstruction process complicated and sometimes violent. One of the first steps was to issue an amnesty for most Southern soldiers and officials, on the condition that they swear allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, accept the abolition of slavery. This allowed tens of thousands of people to return home and restore their property, but was also controversial. Northern radicals considered it too lenient. Southerners still secretly harbored the idea of waiting for the right time. The three constitutional amendments enacted during this period changed the foundation of American society. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship and equal rights under the law to all people born or naturalized in the United States. 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited discrimination in voting rights based on race, color, or previous status as a slave. In theory, this was a huge step forward, but in practice, implementation was hampered by numerous local laws and social prejudices. After emancipation, millions of blacks had to build new lives for themselves. Many found land to farm, worked on plantations or in factories. Some formed their own communities, built churches and schools. But they also faced black codes, restricted freedom, forced labor for former landowners, violence from extremist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, discrimination in hiring and land distribution. The government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help provide food and medicine, help find jobs, sign labor contracts, establishing schools for blacks and the poor. This was the first time the federal government had intervened deeply in the social life of the South. But limited funds and strong opposition from state governments made the results uneven. The process of Reconstruction was not peaceful. Many Southern officials were stripped of power and replaced by Northerners or elected blacks. Secret armed groups threatened and killed activists. Race riots occurred in places such as Memphis, 1866, and New Orleans, 1866. These events showed that changing the law did not mean changing social thinking. In addition to social reform, Reconstruction also aimed to restore the Southern economy. Investment capital was mainly from the North, leading to economic dependence. The sharecropping system was born. Farmers, both black and poor white, rented land from the owner, paying him a percentage of the crop. This system kept production going but created a vicious cycle of poverty. By the mid-1870s, the North was losing patience. The cost of Reconstruction was high. Public opinion wanted to focus on industrial development and expansion into the West. In 1877, as part of a political settlement, the Union troops withdrew from the South, ending Reconstruction. Control returned to the white leaders of the South, and many of the reforms that had been achieved began to erode. On April 9, 1865, the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared. But in the minds of hundreds of thousands of people, the war never ended. Many veterans from the South and the North suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Though it had no name at the time, they returned home, but their minds were still on the battlefield. A sudden knock on the door could make them jump, as if they were under attack. A distant explosion, whether it was thunder or fireworks, would send their hearts racing and their sweat breaking out. There was no family in the South that did not lose at least one member. Some lost fathers, brothers, sons. Some lost everything: loved ones, homes, possessions, and even their faith in the future. The physical loss could be measured, but the mental loss could not. Silent dinners with empty chairs, holidays without the laughter of the deceased, all become invisible cuts. Repeated year after year, many veterans choose not to talk about the war. They fear that if they do, the memories will become too vivid, will come flooding back. But that silence is not forgetting. It is like locking a wild beast in a closed room. Occasionally, the beast roars in their dreams. or in sudden moments when memories are stirred up. Their children grow up in that heavy atmosphere, learning to avoid asking, to avoid touching the wounds they cannot see but feel clearly. Another psychological problem is the feeling of losing social position. Before the war, many Southern soldiers were the pillars of their families, members of prestigious communities. After the war, the ideals they fought for have collapsed. The old jobs are gone. The land is lost. They felt they were redundant in the new society. This led to depression, low self-esteem, and sometimes violence in the family or community. Doctors at that time recorded many cases of weak nerves in veterans, insomnia, frequent startles, recurring nightmares. Patients said they often dreamed of the last battle they participated in, the faces of friends falling right next to them, the chaotic sounds of guns, artillery, screams. Medical science at that time did not understand PTSD. So these people were often considered weak or unmanly, making them even more withdrawn. Not only individuals, but also the whole community suffered psychological wounds. A collective sense of humiliation due to failure. The fear of being overwhelmed by the culture and economy of the North. Suspicion of other people, both regional and racial. This led many Southern communities to close themselves off, building invisible walls from the outside world, maintaining oral stories about the Golden Age before the war as a way to preserve their identity. From these psychological wounds and the need to find meaning in the sacrifice, the Lost Cause movement was formed, depicting the Civil War as a war for states' rights, not slavery, seeing Southern generals as tragic heroes, turning defeat into a symbol of honor and loyalty. This movement helped many people find solace, but also perpetuated prejudices and social divisions for decades. The psychological wounds of the Civil War generation did not stop with them. Their children grew up with stories of loss, of enemies, of honor. Many values and prejudices were passed down as self-evident truths. Regional polarization persisted in politics, education, and culture. Thus, the war ended on the battlefield, but it still smoldered in the minds and hearts of the people. There were individuals and organizations that sought to soothe the emotional wounds. Veterans associations organized meetings to share and support each other. Churches became places of spiritual comfort. Some doctors experimented with treatments such as rest, journaling, or light labor. However, due to limited medical knowledge, most veterans had to deal with nightmares and feelings of emptiness on their own. Psychological wounds were the dark side of Reconstruction, little recorded in textbooks, but deeply affecting post-war American social life. It explains why, despite the signing of peace and Reconstruction, true harmony remained elusive, because it takes only a few months to mend a broken bridge. But it can take centuries to mend a human heart.